Hello, my name is Kyle, and this is Killer Cosmos. Today we're going to assess the birth chart of Ted Bundy, arguably the most infamous serial killer in American history. Now, my approach to astrology incorporates primarily Hellenistic techniques. However, my interpretation will tend to lean a bit more modern, that is to say, relatively less deterministic or black and white in nature. Do not believe that a birth chart can guarantee anything as specific as someone being a serial murderer. There are many ways that the symbolism in any given birth chart can play out, so if you recognize any similarities between your own or anyone you know's birth chart, chill out. Don't jump to any conclusions or start calling your local police tip hotline. That being said, Bundy's chart is certainly one of the more literal and easy to identify where propensity for violence might come from. But before we dig into the chart, we'll go over a brief summary of Bundy's life and character. So, Ted Bundy was born Theodore Robert Cowell on November 24th, 1946, to Eleanor Louise Cowell at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers. His mother had originally planned to give him up for adoption, but at the insistence of her father, Ted spent the first few years of his life in the care of his maternal grandparents. To protect him and Louise from the shame and stigma of being born out of wedlock, Ted was raised to believe that his mother was his sister and that his grandparents were his mother and father. In fact, Ted may not have discovered the truth until as late as 1969. The identity of Bundy's biological father remains unknown. However, several theories exist, one of which being Ted's maternal grandfather, Samuel Cowell. Whether Cowell was Ted's biological father or not, it appears that Louise moved to Tacoma, Washington with Ted in 1950, largely to escape the influence of her abusive and generally toxic father. In 1951, she met and married Johnny Culpepper Bundy, who adopted Ted. Ted spent the rest of his childhood and adolescence growing up in Tacoma with his mother and adopted father and 4 step-siblings. While Ted's environment in Tacoma seems to be one in which he was generally well-loved and supported, he exhibited strange behavior from an early age. One story describes Ted as a toddler laying knives around one of his aunts as she slept. He struggled with a speech impediment, frequently stuttering, and in later life, he was known to slip into a kind of English accent at times. He never really had any close friends, and he was described as generally aloof or not entirely there. As a child, he enjoyed building tiger traps in the woods. At one point, a young girl fell into one of his traps and sliced her leg on one of the spikes. Bundy reportedly liked to trick people, convince people of made-up accomplishments, and he would entertain fantasies of himself as kind of being someone special and extra important. In high school, despite being generally regarded as well-liked by his fellow students, he was kind of fairly popular, he had no close friends or was really involved in any dating. He was arrested twice before turning 18 on suspicion of burglary and auto theft. And according to at least one account by Bundy himself, he had developed a pretty avid interest in pornography and violent images that he would find in true crime magazines. And he also enjoyed sneaking around his neighborhood and peeking in to the windows of young ladies. After graduating high school, Bundy seems to have had a pretty hard time finding direction. He eventually ended up attending the University of Washington to study Chinese. It would be at University of Washington where Bundy would enter his first serious romantic relationship. She's generally referred to by the alias Stephanie Brooks. She eventually ended the relationship with Ted not long after he dropped out of University of Washington in 1968, citing his lack of ambition and prospects. The breakup seems to have been a pivotal turning point in Bundy's evolution. It does appear that Bundy was pretty butthurt by the breakup. He ended up traveling across the country, visiting family along the way, and making his way back to his hometown of Burlington, where it is believed that he discovered his birth certificate and the kind of truth behind his parentage. Ted did eventually recover, and he re-enrolled in the University of Washington to study psychology. He became increasingly active in the Washington Republican Party and started dating Elizabeth Klopfer, a single mother and divorcee who worked as a secretary at the University of Washington's medical school. He also spent some time working at Seattle's Suicide Hotline Crisis Center. People who knew Bundy at this time described him as, charismatic, kind, empathetic, generally a friendly and helpful guy. He developed a reputation within the Republican Party for his intelligence and aggressive approach. One of his jobs during Governor Daniel Evans' re-election campaigns was to shadow Evans' opponent while posed as a supporter to collect information. Bundy would end up being appointed to Seattle's Crime Prevention Advisory, even taking part in the publication of a rape prevention handout. He would also serve as assistant to Republican Party State Chairman Ross Davis, whom he would become fairly close with. In 1973, after receiving his degree in psychology, Bundy began attending law school in Salt Lake City while still living in Seattle. He also rekindled the relationship with Stephanie Brooks while still maintaining the relationship with Klopfer. Brooks would later suspect that Bundy's carefully manicured image as an ambitious and successful young professional was in reality part of a more long-term and elaborate plot to get revenge on her for breaking up with him. In January of 1974, after they had been talking about marriage, Bundy abruptly broke off contact. When she did finally get a hold of him, Bundy pretended like he had no idea what she was talking about, and they never spoke again. Interestingly, this incident would coincide with the beginning of Bundy's first documented murder, or at least his first attempt. Ted Bundy is credited with the murder of at least 30 women across about 6 states between the years of 1974 and 1978. Bundy would often lure in his victims with his disarming charm and good looks, the hypnotic dance of his unibrow, or ask for assistance while wearing his arm in a sling or a neck brace. Often after he had successfully gotten women into his car, he would take them to a secluded location and either bludgeon or strangle them to death, often while raping them. He took pleasure in terrorizing his victims, and in one case, he abducted 2 women in one day so that he could make one watch while he killed the other. Bundy liked to revisit the bodies of his victims, usually in order to engage in necrophilia with their bodies. He was eventually arrested for the first time in 1975 and eventually convicted of attempted kidnapping and assault in 1976. Managed to escape custody twice before finally being convicted of several counts of murder in 1979 and sentenced to death. In 1989, he was executed by electric chair in Florida. All right, so now that we have a sense of Bundy, his character, the kind of shenanigans he got himself up to, actually take a look at the birth chart. So, for Bundy, we have a birthday, November 24th, 1946, 10:35 p.m. in Burlington, Vermont. So for those of you just following along with the audio version, we end up with a chart with Leo on the rising, 25 degrees, with Saturn and Pluto in the first house. Saturn at 8 degrees, 52 minutes retrograde, and Pluto also retrograde. We have the Sun in Sagittarius in the 5th house, about 2 degrees, 16 minutes, and the Moon at 17 degrees, 42 minutes Sagittarius. Now, because the Sun is solidly below the horizon, we know that this is a night chart. Now, that's going to be extra important in general, but especially as we take a closer look at his first house. Now, the first house is traditionally considered the house most associated with the actual person, the mind and body of the person in question, that and the ruling planet. The other houses are going to tend to show you in other areas of life or other people, but often, the way that you experience those other houses really go a long way towards shaping who you ultimately become. So in Bundy's case, we have Saturn in the first house in a night chart. In a night chart, Saturn, it's what is traditionally referred to as the out of sect malefic. You know, it's not very friendly at night, and it's especially not super friendly when it's in Leo. It is considered to be in its detriment in Leo. So we immediately know that there is something wrong, some kind of difficulty with the body or the mind of the individual in question. So, what kind of problems would those be? Well, often with Saturn and Leo, we get narcissism. Not every Saturn in Leo, but it's one of the things that does seem to show up. Saturn is confused in the sign of Leo. So, with this placement, you might see somebody who's maybe confused about who they are or has difficulty differentiating properly the distinction between itself and other people, which is often the problem with narcissists is they often see other people as extensions of themselves in some way. Leo doesn't really want to have Saturn in it either. It's very much the antithesis of what Leo is all about. Leo's about self-expression and the radiating power, in essence, of the sun, while Saturn is about boundaries, darkness. The end of things, death in a broader sense. Saturn here is really restricting the ability to properly Leo. It's also retrograde. In fact, it just stationed retrograde. It was within 7 days ago. So we have here a bad Saturn, right? So what is a good Saturn? A good Saturn might look like, Saturn in Aquarius in a day chart. You would be looking at somebody with a very good sense of, their own place in the world and everyone else's. This would be somebody with, a healthy self-interest, but is really, looking kind of out for the greater good. Also with like a very long-term view of things. It can, sit down and do the hard work that's necessary to get done, whether it really feels like it or not, or whether it's going to provide, immediate benefit. Daytime Saturn in Aquarius would signify somebody who has a firm set of principles and is very much, willing to take responsibility and be held accountable. These are things that, Saturn deals with. And, they're not super fun things, but they're very important. So in Bundy's case with the Saturn, we can probably reasonably assume that for the most part, this person is not any of those things, at least not naturally. Those things can be learned over time, but they're not going to come naturally to somebody with this particular placement. Now, this is, of course, not the whole story. It never is. There's all sorts of mitigating circumstances that you can find in the chart that often offset these difficulties. We might want to look at where the sun is. Any planet in Leo that isn't the sun is going to be looking for the sun for some direction, how to operate there. And in Bundy's case, we have the sun in Sagittarius at 2 degrees, 16 minutes in the 5th house. Not a bad placement for the sun. It's in a fire sign. Sun likes that. It's also, applying to a trine with Saturn. That's, usually pretty helpful. Often with the ruler of the first house in the 5th. The 5th house is among other things, the house of like good things happening to, the physical body. Also deals with, sexuality, creativity, children, but it usually indicates somebody who is generally pretty healthy, often, relatively attractive with, maybe some kind of sexual appeal. Add some points in that direction. Now, in a night chart, as a kind of general rule of thumb, the sun tends to be less important. It's not above the horizon where it can be seen, which is really what the sun wants to be doing. And the moon tends to take a bit of precedence. Nonetheless, the sun is playing an important role. But what that really is going to indicate is that this sun is going to, be a little more introverted, a little more withdrawn. It's going to kind of add to a theme that's already kind of in Bundy's chart, this sense of not being seen, or at least not being seen properly, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. It's going to really tamp down, though, all the significations of the sun in Sagittarius, both for better and for worse. The sun in Sagittarius, you do see a lot of more philosophically minded, often very opinionated, occasionally arrogant people. There's some tendencies towards that. But, it's generally a pretty optimistic and fun placement for the sun, usually pretty exciting and excitable. You do get some larger than life characters sometimes with it being a Jupiter ruled sign. And, we do know with Ted Bundy that he knew how to turn on the charm when he wanted to. In fact, that ability served him pretty well for his purposes. Saturn is known to feign appearances, misrepresent itself, particularly when it's, not in great shape. And in Bundy's case, he was very good at putting on the facade of the sun. He knew how to play the part, and he would, use that to other people's detriment. It's another thing that often gets associated with, positive aspects with malefic planets. Good for the person, not always great for other people. But anyway, we also have in Bundy's fifth house here with the sun, we have Mars at 13 degrees, 22 minutes, and the moon at 17, 42 minutes, as well as the south node at 11 degrees, 42 minutes. Now, that's going to tell us a bunch of stuff, but the sun, moon, all hanging out with the south node. That's going to tell us that Bundy was born right around an eclipse. I believe the day before Bundy was born, not a particularly strong one, but, an eclipse nonetheless. And symbolically, again, we get this theme of things being hidden. The moon is, blocking out the sun, and it's with Mars. So that Mars is kind of being eclipsed right along with it. So really all of that is hidden in a sense under the surface, obfuscated. And, it's definitely relevant that it's with the south node. A lot of things get associated with the nodes, and they, in some sense, they're all true. But, one thing that the nodes do generally that you can kind of count on is that they're going to make planets act weird. They tend to get a little freaky, really closely conjunct a node. Now, the south node tends to make less of things in a material sense, while the north node tends to make more. It tends to make things bigger and more confusing. I think more typically it's just kind of, whatever's around the south node is just, it's not as big of a deal, or it's just not, just don't make as much of that topic. Kind of aim for simplicity. There are cases, though, where a lot of different things seem to show up. The south node's associated with decay, sacrifice, letting things go. And, sometimes you can't help but see that play out very literally. While I think in Bundy's chart, this shows up in lots of other areas. You do get a Mars that is engaging in the cutting away of human beings. Another quick thing about the South Node that's just like a personal observation. You probably won't see this in a textbook. When you think of the North Node as kind of the head of the dragon, the South Node, sometimes it's like the dragon's asshole. It's kind of where the dragon takes a shit. In like some extreme cases, you get the planets around the South Node engaging in some filthy, kind of nasty behavior. This being maybe one of those cases. But when something is shitty, maybe you wanna sacrifice it. Maybe you're not so attached to it when it just doesn't seem all that great. I also kind of see the South Node in this particular case as disrupting or polluting Saturn's reception with the Sun, or maybe giving Saturn the wrong kind of feedback, maybe adding to Saturn's confusion rather than alleviating it. Now, as we move on to these other planets in Sagittarius, it's important to note that their ruling planet, Jupiter, is in Scorpio and traditionally considered to be in aversion. They're not making an aspect to each other. There's not really kind of like an antitia or anything like facilitating the relationship, which tends to be not so great, tends to make the planets in that sign a little lacking in direction, or lacking in proper resources. Interestingly, though, Mars is in Jupiter's sign, and Jupiter is in Mars's sign. Now, it's this form of mutual reception. And a lot of traditional astrologers, given that there isn't really an aspect there, wouldn't consider this a real mutual reception. And while I don't tend to see this nearly as strong as a mutual reception where there's an aspect or just a sign-based aspect, they do function. Like there is, usually some support there. And you can definitely see, you can see them kind of swapping and trading in a person's life. So it is helpful often. Now, speaking of Mars, now that Mars is also ruling Ted's fourth house, which relates to parentage, the home, the foundation, or the mother or the father. I think generally it's fair to say that the fourth house is going to tell you something about the parents. And it's interesting that the ruler of the fourth is on that south node, eclipsed, hidden. It's under the beams even. And we still don't know who Ted Bundy's father is. And he didn't either. Mars is also ruling the ninth house. And in Vedic astrology, the ruler of the ninth house or planets in the ninth house, signify the father in some way, which makes sense. Even in Hellenistic astrology, the ninth house is known as the house of God, the house where the sun finds its joy, the sun also being a significator for the father. You get a lot of indicators here suggesting that the identity of the father is hidden in some way, or they're just not around. Now, Mars and Sagittarius more generally, there's often, an impulsiveness, kind of a lust for adventure, and a tendency to be maybe dogmatic or even fanatical in their beliefs. Usually pretty good philosophical debaters. And Bundy, he did go to law school. He did represent himself at his trial, although not terribly successfully, often to his own detriment. Mars and Sagittarius can certainly have a very strong belief in itself and the abilities that may or may not actually land in real life. And certainly with Bundy, he did have a very unrealistic sense of his own abilities. Hubris can certainly be something you might find with Mars, Mars and Sagittarius. And Bundy, as he his murder spree really picked up, he did have a sense that he was the cops would never catch him. It was just impossible, to the point where when he was caught, he had a hard time reconciling with that. But nonetheless, at his trial, even though it can be kind of comical watching it at the end, even as the judge was sentencing him to death, was kind of admitting that he was impressed with Bundy to some degree. Anyway, so we really just keep getting this theme reinforced with Bundy of looking the part, but not actually doing any of it. Like even with athletics. Sports specifically, Bundy liked to tell people about the sports that he played or awards that he won, but he didn't actually really do any of that. And he was not athletic. I think hunting and murdering women was really his only sport of choice. That and skiing. He was known to enjoy a good ski from time to time. Now, that's not to say that there weren't more energetic and productive periods of Ted Bundy's life. He, did have a, pretty successful run with the Republican Party in Washington. He did complete his degree in psychology. There are certainly many things that Ted Bundy could have been successful at if he had really wanted to. The fifth house, it's a positive house. It's a house of good things, fun things, enjoyable things. It can be kind of the house of doing whatever the fuck you want. And what can be maybe a dark side of that is that the things that are enjoyable to us are not always good for us or good for other people or necessarily productive. People with really heavy fifth house emphasis are definitely going to gravitate strongly towards things they enjoy doing. And sometimes that can indicate getting to do what you love for a living. Sometimes that can also indicate doing what the fuck you want and not necessarily living a very productive life. Unfortunately, in Bundy's case, the ego boost that he really got from, success in the political sphere or in the academic sphere just really didn't do it for him the way that murdering women did. And that ultimately became the main focus of his attention. Now, in regards to the moon The moon's very important in any chart, particularly in a night chart, as it functions as the sect light. It's the source of light at nighttime, right? And while the moon, definitely does say a lot about emotional response and general state, it also is like one of the just general significators for the incarnation of the person in general, the body, also the mother, women. A lot falls under the moon. Being in a Jupiter ruled sign, it's generally pretty positive placement. People with the moon in Sagittarius are pretty upbeat, don't tend to dwell on things or get really caught up in deep, heavy emotions. And while the moon in Sagittarius tends to be a above averagely happy moon, it's not a very moony moon. The moon in Sagittarius doesn't make a traditional aspect with, either Cancer, its ruling sign, Taurus, its exaltation, or, Scorpio, its fall, or Capricorn, its detriment. It's not really tuned in to the major issues of the moon. Often, moon and Sagittarius people are very intelligent, but they take a philosophical approach to emotional topics. Often, moon and Sagittarius people feel the most at home when they're out and about traveling. They're not usually homebodies. They're not usually in a big hurry to settle down and have a family or have a bunch of people to take care of. Not that they don't ever. There's a lot of other factors that you would typically take into account. There is, however, a general restlessness. There's a kind of fear of losing personal freedom or being tied down. They like to keep their options open most of the time, at least when they're younger. Kind of the other side of that is sometimes a tendency to wander and maybe feel kind of lost. There can be a moodiness to the moon and Sag people. One of the moon's many roles is kind of as the emotional processing unit, and the moon and Sagittarius person has some negative shit to feel. They're gonna probably prefer to move on from that rather than sit and process it. So there can be kind of a build up sometimes. They really don't like having their good vibes fucked with, and there can often be a lot of denial. And while that particular characteristic, the denial element, definitely shows up for Bundy, his mother, interestingly, I believe it was a reporter or the police officer, detective, many years after Bundy had been put in prison, kind of leading up to his execution, when he had started to confess periodically. He would kind of confess and then kind of go back on it and deny ever having said it. For the most part, he really didn't like to discuss his role in the crimes. When he did, it was usually in the third person. But when this person, met with Bundy's mother and kind of told her that, he kind of admitted to it because she really was in denial about his guilt, she kind of went like, "Oh dear," in this moment, and then was like, "Would anybody like some pie?" I have no idea what her moon was, but it often says a lot about the mother. His mother did also, move him across country when he was young. Definitely a moon in Sagittarius signification, but definitely get the sense that she didn't want to really take too seriously anything that was going on with her son, even kind of growing up. Now, it's also worth noting that Bundy did hold a lot of anger towards his mom, a lot of resentment for keeping, the truth about who his parents were from him. And you do see that with the moon being pretty closely conjunct with Mars. It is separating, but even just that co-presence, we don't necessarily love to see the moon and Mars together. You generally say that a person with a moon-Mars connection has some irritability or anger to work with that often stems from the relationship with their mother. It's always important to look at the next applying aspect for the moon. And if we were looking at his chart before we had discovered the outer planets that are, not visible with the naked eye, it would look like the moon is basically void of course by pretty much any definition. Essentially, a void of course moon is a moon that is not going to be making, it's not going to be applying to any aspects with any other planets, either by the modern definition before it leaves the sign that it's currently in, but more traditionally, within the next 30 degrees. Now, it will eventually make a sextile with Jupiter at 13 degrees Scorpio. So, it does have an aspect about, what's that, 26 or so degrees. You don't need to get too hung up on the exact number, but that will often show up as somebody who has difficulty, making connections or finding direction in life. Now, one of the big mitigating factors for having a void of course moon is having a benefic planet, Venus or Jupiter, in an angular house, like the first, fourth, seventh, or 10th. And Bundy has that. He has two of them. And he did find direction of a kind, and the condition of those benefics does a really great job of describing exactly what that direction was. Now, the moon is applying to an opposition with Uranus within about 3 degrees, which is certainly going to destabilize the emotions and really the life of the person in general. It is probably fair to say that Bundy was emotionally disturbed in some way. He was diagnosed at one point with manic depression, I believe when he was in prison, which, sure, maybe, but he was known, excuse me, to, have sudden shifts in mood, which he was, for the most part, very good at keeping hidden from people. But, his behavior and emotional state did become visibly erratic as, he really started killing. I think that kind of mask really started to slip off, and he did become very unstable during the period where he, after his initial arrest and before he was formally charged with murder. The police were following him, and he knew it, and he did become very paranoid. And, when he was imprisoned, that restlessness and that need to be free really fueled his, two successful escape attempts. Now, I've definitely spent a lot more time with the Sagittarius placements than I had planned to, because it's really in the 4th house where we get to the meat, to the real interesting shit that's going on with this chart. But before I do, I would like to read just a quick, fun little excerpt from Book 1 of the Anthology of Vettius Valens.
Saturn, Mars, and the Moon cause men to be venturesome in their business enterprises and noble, but ineffective, meeting with reversals and violence. They become in turn violent, reclusive, wicked. They have a plundering and thievish disposition and become defendants in trials. They experience detention and criminal charges, unless of course the nativity happens to be fond of wrestling or of weapons, in which case the detention configuration is fulfilled by the holds of wrestling. Some become injured or diseased and will suffer a violent end.
I think he makes a good point, and it's actually something I'm a big believer in, is that the symbolism in a chart can play out in lots of different ways. Usually my recommendation for a really difficult configuration is find a more productive or less unpleasant version of that to live out. Offset, really difficult placements that way. Wrestling, might have actually worked out pretty well. Saturn with the kind of constraining, that's what he means by holds. And you got your Mars Moon, a competitive sport where you constrain or restrict the movement of other humans' bodies. There are indeed many ways to do that. But, obviously something as simple as wrestling is not going to be the cure for something as complex as, psychopathy. Unfortunately, with all my astrological powers, I do not know the cure for that. But, more generally for anger issues or an more general aggressive tendency. And, call it like it is. Some of us just like to punch people. And there are other people in the world that will let you punch them, usually as long as they can punch you back. But, maybe if Bundy had been introduced to wrestling at like the age of 5, that course of life could have been altered a bit. Anyway, in the 4th, we have Jupiter at 13 degrees, applying to a conjunction with the IC at 16 degrees, Venus at 20 retrograde, and Mercury at 24 retrograde. And the 4th house signifies, family, heritage and all that, but it's really what kind of lays at the foundation of a person and their personality, and where do we get that from, our upbringing. The fourth house represents, that which is personal, private. Very importantly, secrets that the person knows about. Often, with planets in, say, the 12th or the 8th, you may see things that, the person isn't aware of because those houses don't make traditional aspects to the first house. But the fourth is stuff that we're very aware of, stuff that we don't necessarily share with anyone other than the people that we're closest to. People with heavy fourth house emphasis tend to be rather private, sometimes secretive. Scorpio is a rather private and secretive sign as well. Usually have a lot going on with their family history, usually pretty colorful. But they're also often very, very defined by it. Whatever the relationship with their family might be, it plays a very significant role in defining them. Now, all on its own, this looks kind of nice, or, not too bad at least. You got Venus and Jupiter together in the same sign. Venus is retrograde, but through that retrograde is like applying to a conjunction with Jupiter, which isn't bad at all. That's kind of nice. Venus is in Scorpio. It's a sign where Venus isn't usually too happy, and being retrograde, you do tend to get a Venus that is not super interested in consensus or coming to agreement with others. Doubly so in the sign of Scorpio, a Mars-ruled sign, which is not so great because Venus in a night chart is kind of has like the big role to play in delivering the good stuff in life. And while Jupiter isn't at its strongest at night, and not fabulously strong in the sign of Scorpio, it does tend to be a little prone to indulging in moral relativism. A little bit of subjective morality. Speaking for myself, and probably most of the people who would listen to something like a birth chart reading for a serial killer, I don't see anything wrong with finding beauty in or finding deeper philosophical meaning in things like horror movies or true crime, which, I would expect from this combination. And, Bundy, he was a bit of a fan of the true crime, maybe a bit too big of a fan. But I think it becomes really relevant when you notice that all those fourth house planets are being overcome by a superior square from Saturn and Pluto. It's actually real tight with Pluto and Jupiter. But when you have a planet like Saturn in a condition that's really making it about as malefic as it can be, overcoming those planets, Jupiter, Venus, Mercury, by a square, you're going to see some not great stuff come out of that. This is really a pretty menacing configuration. It's pretty bad. There are some ways that it could be worse, like the fact that for the most part, it's just a sign-based square between Saturn and Venus and Mercury, at least, and Jupiter. It's separating. It's worth giving Bundy some credit for only murdering women that he didn't know. He was, in fact, able to carry on several relationships with women who he did not murder. Makes this such a nasty setup is really just the lack of reception taking place between these planets. Venus and Saturn in particular are, they're already in detriment, and really none of the planets involved have any significant rulership or dignity in Leo or Scorpio. Jupiter has a little bit in Leo and fire signs in general with triplicity. Venus has a bit in water signs, which, helps her out of her detriment a little bit. But basically what it means is that there's not really much reason for the Scorpio planets and the Leo planets to really work with each other. When I think of reception, planets having rulership or sort of guest host relationship with planets they're making aspects with, as a former student of international relations, one of the things we studied was the way that international trade and an economic interdependence between nations is really a key factor, and arguably the key factor in maintaining peace between nations. It's a big reason why we haven't had a world war since the end of World War II. In essence, peace has become more profitable than war, at least amongst the great powers, the more economically developed nations. And similarly, with planets and signs interacting in a chart, it's nice to see planets either, in their own sign and some kind of dignity, so they have kind of their own resources and they don't need to fuck with anyone else too much, or making aspects with planets that it rules or the ruling planet of the sign it's in. But in a chart like Bundy's, where there is really not very much of that going on at all, it's similar to kind of an international environment where resources are scarce and nations aren't making strong agreements with each other or trading with each other. And that Saturn in Bundy's first house starts to look a little bit like a Genghis Khan or Adolf Hitler or some other conqueror ready to swoop in and take what they want by force. Really, Venus and Jupiter being damaged, but Saturn, is benefiting to some degree. And, that normally would be reflected in a person's life. Unfortunately, in this case, it shows up as Ted really enjoying the pain and suffering that he inflicted on the women that he killed. But we didn't say a ton about Pluto in the first, which is, very relevant, though Pluto on its own doesn't tend to do a whole lot, I find. It really needs other planets to play with. And in this case, it has other planets to play with, for sure. Pluto is, it's an interesting planet. It does interesting things that are sometimes hard to describe. But a lot of times, the first thing that comes up with Pluto is obsession, right? Pluto will kind of drill a hole into a topic and digs into the deep, dark, nasty underbelly of something, exposing, what's underneath. I'm a big fan of the astrologer Patrick Watson's analogy he uses to describe Pluto as it makes planets radioactive. Now, it's a really good analogy when you think about what Pluto does and what, radioactivity does to things, as well as how we respond to radioactivity. Radioactivity to a body, it causes rapid mutation of the cells, almost always killing them, but in some cases, at least in theory, creating mutations that might be otherwise positive. In fact, there's arguments that there's kind of the radiation that we get exposed to naturally, has some role to play in how evolution takes place, or that sort of gradual kind of low level mutation that occurs. When that awesome mutation eventually comes, creating that superior version of the species, if you will, it kind of necessitates that the old version has to die off. It's a natural part of evolution. But that kind of process is best when it takes place over a very long period of time and when it's very slow and gradual. And most of the time, that's, how Pluto works. Often when there's too much radiation or radioactivity, like, say, a big barrel of radioactive goo, what do we do with that? We stick it in a barrel and we bury it underground and hope that nobody, accidentally digs it up for however many half-lives for that radioactivity to decay. Often Pluto will bring out the deeper primordial or darker part of the sign that it's in, or a planet that it's touching, and make us want to bury it or hide it because it's dangerous or frightens us. But it's always kind of there whispering to us, and often it becomes hard to ignore when you have really tight aspects with Pluto, or a really intense Pluto transit. For the most part, in real life, it doesn't play out in quite such a melodramatic and negative way. I mean, you often do have a lot of negative experiences with Pluto, but often you end up exposing something that is fundamentally true and maybe not even as scary as you thought it was. But anyway, with the Pluto and Leo generation, it was a generation that was obsessed in many ways with individuality and personal will. I mean, you had the counterculture movement, and Aleister Crowley became a big figure in popular culture, right? Thelema, Do what thou willst is the whole of the law. You get the first, rock stars, and you get rock stars being kind of the principal figures in culture in many ways, the kind of prime movers in cultural development. Now, turning to Bundy himself, who had it very prominently in his first house, usually you would think this person might have a bit of an obsession with self aggrandizement, somebody who is or would at least like to be in a position of power, right? Power that would magnify and intensify the sense of self, the identity, in many ways. A person might define themselves by the degree of power they had over other people, especially with the presence of Saturn, where the ability to express and define the self is going to be very restricted, confused, frustrated. This is going to be somebody who is very likely to get the wrong idea about who they are. And that played out pretty literally in Bundy's case. From an early age, Bundy was very much reported to be rather fixated on seeing himself as somebody who would grow up to be very powerful and very special and very, a person of clout, person, deserving of respect. And Bundy very much, needed to see himself that way. He's also somebody who would lie about things that he accomplished, Saturn, to project this image of success and authority. And then, as I mentioned earlier, Saturn in Leo has this association with narcissism, Saturn being the planet that defines that boundary between oneself and other people. Especially for Bundy, it's ruling his seventh house, and being in the sign of Leo, the me sign, really. It's the we planet in the me sign. And hanging out with Pluto, which has this tendency to take things to the extreme, basically distilling something down to its essence and exaggerating it, often creating a very extreme version of something that we get obsessed with. Pluto totalizes, in a sense. And when you think, how might Pluto totalize what Saturn and Leo wants to do? It might look a bit like, how can I make someone else part of me permanently and forever? Now, keeping all that in mind as really kind of the general agenda of Saturn and Pluto in Leo in the first, we can start to get a sense of what kind of damage they're doing to those fourth house planets and in what ways they might want to co-opt or use, those fourth house planets to kind of suit their ends. Jupiter is in a really, really tight square, pretty much exact square with Pluto. It's applying within about 16 minutes and separating from a square from Saturn. But in this case, Jupiter is besieged, in a sense, by the rays of Saturn and Pluto, to the point where, maybe it can't do so much to help out Venus. Now, Jupiter, has a lot of different jobs. It's going to have a lot of different jobs in any given chart, depending on what houses it rules, what house it's in. But it also just has the Jupiter job. And one of the Jupiter jobs is really distinguishing between right and wrong, the moralizing faculty, distinguishing what is and is not fair, what is justice, what makes life good, and how do we create more of that. Now, Jupiter in Scorpio, when it's not afflicted, is generally pretty creative and pretty good at doing that job in and amidst the kind of darker, we'll say muddy or dirty waters in Scorpio. It's kind of good at making good stuff out of that. And, that's a good function to have. If we don't find good and positive ways to use or clean our sewage, it will eventually overflow and take over the city, right? However, with Bundy in his chart, that faculty is damaged and kind of being forced to serve the agenda of, for lack of a better word, really malefic, these really malefic planets in the first. Now, to highlight how that really played out for Bundy, read a little quote here. He said, "Guilt is an illusion, a social construction to control people. I am in an enviable position to not have to feel guilt. Now, Saturn is often associated with guilt, creating guilt. Often where Saturn is in a given chart is going to be an area of life where that person tends to feel guilty or have guilt. Now, it kind of seems like maybe Saturn and Pluto sort of used that Jupiter faculty to construct a moral argument against the need to feel guilt, right? Because, fuck guilt. Who needs that shit? It's rather annoying when you're trying to do the kind of things that Bundy liked to do, right? Now, for every person in the world with Leo rising, they're going to have Jupiter ruling both their fifth and the eighth. And that does not mean that every Leo rising is going to conflate sexuality and death, okay? There's a lot of other ways that Jupiter can perform the functions of both of those houses, both separately, or, combine them in ways that are much more constructive or much less disturbing. The fifth and eighth houses are about more than just sex and death, but in this case, we can see what do we have? We have somebody who liked to murder women, got sexual gratification from murdering women, and hey, liked to fuck their dead bodies, right? So it's kind of a worst case scenario, which is what you tend to see with a really bad setup like this. It's like you have this badly afflicted Jupiter still trying to be a benefic for Ted. Like you have these really not well-intentioned planets in the first house who really more or less have the run of the chart. And they're saying to Jupiter, hey, I wanna be a big shot. I wanna feel powerful, and I've got some real nasty ideas about what I can do with Venus down there, and I know you can help me out. So give me what you got. And Jupiter's like, I don't know, guys, that's not really my thing. Maybe we can channel that in a more constructive way. And, it works for a while. But, the first house is really able to twist Jupiter's arm. So eventually he's like, okay, all right, you want to kidnap and murder women. I can probably help you out with hiding the bodies. And, if you were to maybe try eating them, it would be kind of like they're part of you. Forever, like you'd own their souls. And the first house is like, Jupiter, I like the way you think, you rascal. Keep it up and I'll let you write a rape prevention pamphlet. And, if you think I'm pushing it a little bit with Jupiter there, you got Venus, right, in Scorpio, retrograde, also being overcome by the sign-based square. And this is where it gets really interesting to me. Venus and Saturn are exactly on each other's contra Antisha. I'll just say that it has to do with the solstice points. And with Antisha, very simplistically, it's kind of thought of as a secretive conjunction. And the contra Antisha is kind of like a secretive, hidden opposition. Now, I personally think that they are a lot more complex than that. But one of the things they often show up as that kind of signify a sort of coercive or manipulative relationship between the two planets, depending on the planets involved. Traditionally, it was thought that the planets in the signs on the lighter half of the zodiac, basically from the beginning of Aries to the end of Virgo, were thought to have the upper hand in the contra Antisha relationship. So this kind of looks like Saturn having this kind of extra power over Venus, this ability to kind of coerce or manipulate Venus into doing what it wants. Now, Venus is a general significator for sexuality, relationships, relationships with women. And, Venus in Scorpio already tends to enjoy maybe playing with power dynamics in relationships, dabbling in like the darker, freakier side of sexuality. And in this relationship with Saturn, you get somebody who was very successful in coercing and manipulating women into his car so that he could, capture and control them and kill them, Scorpio kind of deals with death and decay. Saturn also kind of deals in death. I've just never seen necrophilia spelled out so clearly in a birth chart, ever. It's not that I've ever been really looking for it, except for with Bundy. If you get a reading with me, I'm not going to be trying to figure out if you're a necrophiliac or not. But when you see a pattern in a chart that just repeats, that's just all over the place. Uh, you really got to call it like it is, you know? A lot of people have Saturn Venus squares, oppositions or just hard aspects between Venus and Saturn, and they are often difficult. The vast majority of them are not necrophiliacs, or even particularly keen on hurting anyone. They might have difficult relationships, or there might be some conflation of the principles of pain, Saturn, and pleasure, Venus. You'll really see that with soft aspects too, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's either it's your thing or it's not. Between two consenting adults, it doesn't have to be this really nasty thing, right? It can be fun. Again, it just shows up over and over again. Like you have Mercury opposing the fixed star Algol, which is known, among many other things, for death by decapitation. Its meaning is derived from it being part of the constellation Perseus, where he's holding Medusa's decapitated head. And one of the things Bundy liked to do was keep the heads of the women he killed and do stuff with them, or more specifically, fuck their heads. So again, it's everywhere. It's also Mercury and Venus. They're under the beams. They say metaphorically that planets under the beams kind of get gobbled up by the sun. Sun ruling that Saturn. he liked to eat them a bit too. Mercury's even ruling his second house, which among other things signifies what someone likes to eat, relationship to food. And Mercury is a planet of Venus down there. So what did he like to eat? Again, it's a very literal chart. But it's a good thing to bear in mind as we the quick visit to our friend Vettius Valens, that maybe things that the ancients considered depraved wouldn't be considered depraved today, but there is kind of an extreme end of that spectrum that sort of transcends time and culture. That maybe we're all like, that's not okay, like fucking decapitated heads. But Rhetorius said this:
Venus and Saturn square are much worse. Men take prostitutes as wives, and they become loathsome and depraved. It is even worse if the configuration is in the descendant or the IC. The deterioration noted above becomes even worse if Mars is in conjunction, square opposition. Men then act shamefully and are denounced by everyone. Often, because of this, they become a subject of scandal, are imprisoned, and meet a bad death. If the stars are in lurking signs or degrees, men enjoy impure passions and unnatural pleasures.
Now, Mars is not in hard aspect to either Saturn or Venus. Venus is in a Mars-ruled sign. Saturn is, trine Mars, and trines are not always friendly. While I don't know what he means by a lurking degree, Venus is in a smoky degree, and Saturn is in a dark degree. Sounds rather lurky, if you ask me. I always find it interesting when the often extreme descriptions that ancient astrologers use actually play out rather literally in people's lives, usually in extreme cases, right? Now, as we really ought to move along, I'll lastly say about Venus that Venus also rules the 10th house. 10th house generally signifies what our reputation is, what we're known for doing in the world, our actions in the world. It's the most visible house in your chart. Now, there are many ways that any planet in a chart can make itself known in the 10th house, or really any house for that matter. But really the ruling planet and its kind of main relationships are what's going to really come through. And I think it's pretty clear that Venus and that relationship with Saturn is really what Bundy is most known for. Ted Bundy is famous for his ability to use charm and deception to convince unsuspecting women to get in his car. Venus rules the third as well, where he would take them somewhere hidden, private, fourth house, capture, detain, torture, rape, murder them, all because it gave him sexual gratification to do so. Now, I really do want to get on to applying some timing techniques to Bundy's chart. I also, I don't want to like belabor the point. It's like the same thing keeps getting repeated over and over again with this chart. You have Venus. Venus is also under the beams. of the sun. It's within 15 degrees. So adding to that hidden element, and also the sun kind of gobbling Venus up. Venus is retrograde. So there's the non-consensual element of Ted Bundy's sexuality. Venus is also debilitated, and it's rarely this literal, but Bundy liked to, he liked to bludgeon his victims and keep them unconscious. To literally debilitate them. And it's really not common for astrology to play out this literally. It's literally the most literal chart I've ever encountered, to be honest. But now I want to move on to applying some timing techniques. I primarily use Annual Profections for timing, and that is primarily what I'll be using. But while I am not an expert in the use of zodiacal releasing, I do like to use it for kind of the big picture stuff. And I actually ended up looking at Bundy's zodiacal releasing periods before I really started going over his profections. And it ended up confirming my suspicion that activations of that fourth house of his were really going to signify periods that were significant in his evolution towards what he ultimately became. A serial murderer of women. Now, with zodiacal releasing, when you want to see when a person is likely to have a period of increased activity in terms of their career or just, their general activity in the world, you release from the lot of spirit. And when you get to a sign that is on an angle from the lot of fortune, you get your peak period. It basically symbolically represents a period where your intentions and activity in the world, spirit, align with fate, in a sense, or kind of the material circumstances of your life. And in Ted Bundy's chart, we have the lot of fortune in the first house in Leo, pretty much exactly conjunct Saturn, which it's fair to say that is not a great start if you're looking for indications of a happily ever after for someone. Not that I'd say that in and of itself it's the end of the world, but it doesn't exactly bode well. And then we have the lot of spirit in Virgo in the second house. Now, again, I'm not going to go into interpreting all the periods. I'm just going to note when we hit a peak period, and in this case happens to be the fourth house that gets activated. So applying the technique, you get a Virgo period from 1946 when he was born until we get to a Libra period in August 12th of 1966. And from there, we have an 8-year period until we hit Scorpio, fourth house, July 1st of 1974. And it is in fact 1974 when his first known murder takes place, or if you will, the beginning of his career as a serial killer really takes off. Now, 1974 was also a fourth house profection year for Bundy. In fact, it ends up lining up a little bit better. That profection year would have started November 24th of 1973 and lasted till January 4th of 1974, when Bundy broke into the basement apartment of a young woman named Karen Sparks. Bundy, bludgeoned her unconscious and sexually assaulted her and left her for dead. She did survive. However, she was permanently physically and mentally disabled. Now, it's interesting that on January 4th, Venus and Jupiter were together in the sky in Ted's seventh house, making pretty tight oppositions to Ted's natal Saturn and natal Pluto. So, these two planets that are, together in his chart, angular, making a hard aspect, really receiving a hard aspect from Saturn and Pluto in his fourth, are now in a seventh, in a house that's ruled by Saturn, and also, making hard aspects. Often when you see a placement being both activated by profection and then activated by transit, the symbolism in the chart will often play out in a very vivid way. It's kind of like an opportunity for those same planets to deliver on what's promised in the chart. Now, the following month, February 1st, Ted is much more successful. He does more or less the same thing. He breaks into the basement apartment of a young woman, bludgeons her unconscious, but this time he takes her with him and murders her. Now, this is within just a few days of Ted's progressed moon return, which is essentially when you advance the placement of the natal moon by about a degree every month. Eventually makes its way back to its natal position at about the same age for everybody, around age 27. The progressed moon return is really kind of a coming of age point in everyone's life, coming into your own or reaching the kind of a next stage in maturity and adulthood, coming full circle. It tends to happen not long before the Saturn return, and this does coincide with Ted arguably stepping into what some might argue was his destiny. While I might be a little more reluctant to assign such a specific role as serial killer to somebody's destiny, it does seem to really coincide with Ted Bundy coming into his own and maturing into what he did ultimately become, right? Now, usually when you hit a period, either by profection or by zodiacal releasing, where the sign that is activated contains a benefic, or in this case, both benefics, it usually carries with it positive experiences for the individual. And 1974 does seem to be the year where Ted really enjoys himself the most. Those benefics are being overcome by the most difficult planet in his chart, the out of sect malefic Saturn in his first. However, this period is also laying the groundwork for what would end up being a very negative experience for him, going to prison and eventually being executed. And, it's notable that 1974 really does seem to be a peak period in Ted's public life as well. He was, ironically, working as assistant director of the Seattle Crime Prevention Advisory Commission, where, among other things, he wrote and helped publish a pamphlet for women on rape prevention. Later, he ended up working at the Department of Emergency Services. It was a state agency involved in the search for missing women. Now, if Bundy had just done that, that would have fit in perfectly with his birth chart. Now, it was also during this period that Ted Bundy met Carol Ann Boone, twice divorced, mother of two, who would eventually play a very important role in his life. He would end up marrying her while on trial, ultimately conceiving a daughter with her in a, shall we say, unapproved conjugal visit. I mean, pretty much everything in his fifth house is under the beams of the sun and also being eclipsed. So stands to reason that even his conceiving of children would be done in secret. Now, July of 1974, July 14th, shortly after he entered that peak period, Bundy pulls off a double hitter of sorts, kidnapping two women in the same day from the same beach. And this is when major news coverage really begins, and connecting all these murders. Public awareness that a serial killer is on the loose really begins. And, this kind of atmosphere of fear really starts to develop. And that is very appropriate for the start of one of these angular peak periods. So you usually expect to see someone come to prominence, which he certainly did. But it was also on that same day that he really planted the seed for his own downfall. While he was on that beach playing his numbers game, talking to women, he was overheard introducing himself as Ted, which was reported to the police, filed as evidence, and came up in the news reports about the serial killer that was on the loose. And that, combined with Ted's kind of strange behavior at the time, really activated the suspicions of Elizabeth Klopfer, Ted's girlfriend at the time, who did call the police tip hotline several times, which, would end up adding to the case against Ted when he was eventually caught. And just when this fourth House Profection year was wrapping up, November 8th, Bundy attempted to kidnap another 18-year-old, a telephone operator, Carol Durant, while posing as a police officer. He apparently didn't do a very good job either as posing as a police officer or handcuffing her. And in 1976, it would be for the attempted assault and kidnapping of Carol Durant that Bundy would be tried and convicted. So we can see that this Fourth house perfection, the pivot around which his life really turns. So, if we wanted to get an idea of perhaps when the more pivotal or defining moments or events might have taken place that contributed to the development of, say, the pathology that really fully manifested in 1974, we want to look for the periods where that fourth house is being activated. Now, that's going to be, the other fourth house perfection years, but also the second house perfection years. Because if you were to perfect from the fourth house, you would find that the ruler is in the second house from the fourth, which is going to activate it. So Bundy's first birthday would have initiated the beginning of his first second house perfection year. Now, that would have activated both the fourth house and the third house, given that the ruler of the third, Venus, is in the fourth, the second sign from the third. So we don't really have any records of anything specific happening to Ted Bundy at age 1, but we do know that at the time he was living with his maternal grandparents. We know that his grandfather was a bit of a scumbag. He was known to be abusive, violent, and had a tendency to talk to himself as well as people who weren't there. We know that Bundy exhibited strange and potentially violent behavior from a very young age. We also have the ruling planet of the second in the fourth, also being overcome by Saturn and Pluto, along with Jupiter and Venus. Age 1 is typically a time when children are really developing their language skills. Mercury, being the ruling planet, will tell you a lot about how somebody communicates. Struggled with a stutter at a young age. And, Mercury is retrograde, but it's also about to station direct within 7 days of the time of his birth. Now, that's really going to intensify what Mercury signifies. It's also under the beams. It's kind of being overheated by the sun. So Mercury is like a very fast-moving, kind of hyperactive Mercury. Now, stutters usually come about as a result of anxiety and, in some cases have their origins in, early childhood trauma. Given his living environment at the time, it's really not impossible that a very, very young Bundy may have experienced or witnessed some very significant form of abuse that perhaps left lasting scars on Bundy's psychology. Now, I won't dig into the third house activation too much at the moment, but just I'm going to keep it in my back pocket, and because I think it'll come up later. But that the fourth house gets activated, more directly during the fourth house perfection year at age 3, and now that was the year that his mother took custody of him and moved him across the country to Washington. Now, we don't know if there was a specific event or if it was just the general shittiness of her father that spurred her to take him and leave. But it's, possible that some formative trauma might have occurred around that time. And, the moving may well have been traumatic, or at the very least confusing for, a 3-year-old. Because, to be quite honest, I'm confused about what the actual story was, since he allegedly didn't know that his mother was actually his mother until, according to one source, about age 15, which would have been another fourth house perfection year, but also possibly around age 22. Personally, I think that 15 is the better candidate, just from an astrological perspective, but that doesn't mean that it's necessarily true. But nonetheless, psychologists do seem to point to the confusion around his parentage and the resulting resentment towards his mother as playing a significant role in the development of his psychology. Now, another interesting date to look at is August 31st, 1961, which is the day that 8-year-old Anne-Marie Burr, a young girl living in Bundy's neighborhood at the time, went missing. And many people, including the girl's parents, believe that she was Bundy's first victim. Now, that's certainly possible. It would make a lot of sense given, Bundy was about 14 years old. We know that around this time he had developed the interest in pornography and images of dead women from true crime magazines. And I like this a lot more timing wise for Bundy's first murder if it had been maybe just a few months later. Because a few months later, on his 15th birthday, he would have entered fourth house perfection. Not that the third house is necessarily bad. It is Libra and Venus ruled, and Venus is in the fourth house. And you're going to get, an activation there. And the third house Neptune is pretty interesting for other reasons. Often people with Neptune in the third have difficulty nailing down regular routines, being a house of communication. They're often good at adding color, to their conversation style. But also lying can come up too. Neptune is a planet that deals with deception. That's not always going to be the case, but it is another of many, many indicators that Bundy has in his chart that points to somebody who is deceptive or uses deception. Neptune in Libra is pretty interesting in and of itself. We're going to get a little off track talking about it, but do you think it's relevant for him, given pretty, solid sextiles between Saturn in his first and Mars in his fifth? But I very much associate Neptune in Libra with the American dream. Not that people in other countries didn't also have Neptune in Libra, but that is really where you see the emergence of that very distinctly Venusian and kind of synthetic aesthetic that very much permeated the 1950s and really influenced the people born during that time. Bundy was somebody who very much wanted to look the part of kind of the all-American, handsome, successful conservative even. He was a big participant in the Republican Party. But you also get a lot of people describing the experience of never really knowing what Bundy was up to. If people asked what he was doing, he almost pathologically lied about it. Would usually tell a story that, made him look good. And, even, with those sextiles with Saturn and Mars, not that they're, typically anything to write home about. This seemed to be very much a tool in his toolbox. He was very much able to use his good looks, charm, general affability to maintain this appearance of somebody who's, very innocuous and harmless, and, appealing. I mean, even when he was on trial for murder, there were women across the country that just were in love with Bundy. People didn't want to believe he was guilty because he was, such a nice guy, so good looking. And really everything about his persona and demeanor appealed to this kind of idealized model of what a young, upwardly mobile, clean-cut white American male should be. And, interesting too is that there are multiple reports from victims that escaped or, people that interviewed him, even family members from when he was a kid, that, when he got angry or if he started like talking about the murders, his appearance would physically change. He would look like this kind of totally different person. One of his interviewers said that his eyes would turn black, which gets really interesting with Saturn in the first, and Saturn, tending to feign appearances, has kind of Neptune and the sun at its disposal, very capable of putting on a pleasing facade. And it's actually something that Bundy said, I wish I could remember the exact quote, but something like that the American dream was to be invisible to everyone but yourself. And you can really see that all over his chart, but that Neptune being ruled by Venus in Scorpio retrograde under the beams and in the fourth house, which is very much that stuff that is invisible to everyone but you. And with just how heavily involved Venus is with Saturn and Leo in the first, you can really kind of get a sense of how he might have come to that conclusion. I don't think that is most people's conception of the American dream, even though, in practice, it probably ends up looking a lot like that. Now, anyway, back to the possibility of Bundy having killed Anne-Marie Burr. When you look at his transits on that day, you see that Uranus and the North Node were in a conjunction on his ascendant pretty closely. Mars was conjunct his natal Neptune, and Neptune was applying within 3 degrees to his natal Jupiter. And also worth noting, the moon was transiting his MC on that day, which in and of itself, whatever. But the moon was also transiting his MC the night that he broke into the basement apartment of Karen Sparks, his first known, attempted murder. Now, that could very easily be a coincidence. I'm not looking to make too much out of that, but it is interesting. And his murders, after that did follow. It's like a cyclical kind of monthly pattern. It's like a new murder reported like every month. Now, I do find the Uranus North Node conjunction on his ascendant a lot more interesting. It usually correlates with a radical transformation of the personality, or, a big shift in the way somebody presents themselves in the world. And it does seem around that time that Bundy did start to adopt a more socially functional persona. And that Mars transiting Neptune, maybe wanting to physically act out a fantasy, maybe a violent one, regarding, I don't know, death and sexuality. Neptune transiting Jupiter and the ruler of the fifth and the eighth. I certainly wouldn't write it off. Like the North Node involved in that Uranus conjunction with his ascendant, I would think some erratic behavior might be involved, perhaps some overwhelming impulses. Now, I am very far away from claiming that I've cracked the case in any way, but I do think there's an astrological case to be made for it being plausible that he, was responsible for the disappearance of Carol Ann Boone. Again, I would have liked to see that whole fourth house being activated by perfection. It is being activated, but, the planets in that chart are responsible for ruling about half of his houses. So it is going to be activated that way a lot. Which also makes sense. It's not going to be probably one singular event that really signals the defining moment of Ted Bundy's evolution, or really anyone's for that matter. Okay, so, as much as I found it really interesting going over Bundy's whole life by perfection, I've probably already really tested the limits of most people's attention spans by this point. So let's bring our focus back to that 1974, 1975, and that peak activity period. In 1974, towards the end in November, he would have turned 28, and that would have began his fifth house perfection. During that time, he's putting a little more effort into maintaining appearances. All the murdering he got up to in Washington had gotten way too much attention, so he's really focusing his activities in Colorado and Utah, but he's also, getting more and more preoccupied with murder too. It's getting harder to keep the two worlds separate. And finally, on August 16th, 1975, he is arrested while out on the prowl, if you will, driving without his headlights on. He gets pulled over and he has his murder kit in the back. And from this point on, they don't quite have enough to charge him yet, but they're pretty sure that Ted Bundy is their guy. The day before Bundy is arrested, Jupiter, the Lord of the Year, ruling his fifth house, stations retrograde. And suddenly, Jupiter isn't helping him keep shit a secret anymore. He's under 24-hour surveillance. Up to that point, he had been kind of living the fifth house Sag dream a little bit, taking his killing spree on the road, Marsing up all the moons that he wanted to. But now the party is suddenly over, is getting increasingly paranoid and agitated because he can't kill anyone. Then on September 17th, 1975, Saturn makes its first ingress into Leo, kicking off Bundy's Saturn return. And within a month, he is formally charged with aggravated kidnapping and assault. He is released on bond, paid for by his mother. And then by the time his first trial begins, February 1976, he is in a sixth house perfection year. And, this house is ruled by Saturn. So unlike the fifth house, the sixth house is not a house of good times. It's a house of difficult times, usually hard work, sometimes illness, but also sometimes slavery or imprisonment. If you think of the fifth house as having a lot of personal freedom, the sixth house is having not very much of that. You do tend to see the eighth house more as punishment, maybe the 12th house as imprisonment. The ruling planet, Saturn, had gone retrograde back into Bundy's 12th house. Furthermore, his 12th house is actually being activated, given that if you count 6 houses from the 12th, you get the ruling planet, the moon. The 11th house is being activated in the same way. If you count 6 signs from the 11th, you get the ruling planet Mercury. It's not immediately obvious how that really fits. You usually think the 11th house is a good house. You think friends, but fans show up in the 11th house. Bundy did have a lot of fans during this time, not nearly as many as he would have in the much more public trials that would follow. But with that 11th house activation, you're also activating Uranus, which is, in his 11th house, opposing his moon, the ruler of the 12th. And he really started cooking up schemes to break out of prison during this period because February 1976, he is found guilty and sentenced to 1 to 15 years in prison. And with Bundy now safely locked away, the state of Colorado was able to put its case together for several murders that he committed there. And that takes us to January of 1977, when he is transferred to Aspen and the much more public murder trials begin. Now, this is a 7th house profection, and the topic of relationships certainly wasn't irrelevant. His primary romantic relationship, Elizabeth Cloper, she was certainly very confused about his guilt. And given that the ruling planet, Saturn, is in the first, and Saturn being very confused about itself in the sign of Leo, and guilt being a significator, one of Saturn's significations, you get a pretty literal manifestation of that. But we are also getting a 10th house activation, because if you perfect 7 houses from the 10th, you get the ruling planet Venus in the 4th. And while the Bundy trials aren't quite being broadcast on a nationwide level yet, this is really the beginning of the legend of Ted Bundy, because in June, he manages to escape from the courthouse by jumping out of the courthouse library window. And he tries to cross the mountains, basically gets lost. He's exhausted and starving and forced to return to town, and he is recaptured just like 5 or 6 days later. But this escape attempt coincides with a Neptune conjunction on his natal Mars, directly opposed by Jupiter in Gemini. And we keep getting this Mars-Neptune stuff happening for Bundy at these kind of critical times in his life, or at least, major points in the highlight reel of his life. In this case, it seems kind of with some help from Jupiter and Neptune, he's able to make a kind of brief vanishing act. But, Saturn is, just separating from its exact return in his chart. It's, still right there in his first house. I don't think anyone gets off that easy during a Saturn return. And, Neptune's pretty good at making things disappear or seemingly turn to vapor, but not so great at things like navigation. In fact, probably really good at getting you lost in the mountains. Now, despite this episode, Bundy actually stood a decent chance of winning the case at this point. A lot of evidence was being dismissed. Most of the evidence was pretty circumstantial anyway, and he was being advised by lawyers and friends to just stay put and not make himself look any more guilty than he already did. Nonetheless, Bundy was already plotting a second escape attempt with the help of the woman he would eventually marry while on trial in Florida, Carol Ann Boone. On December 23rd, 1977, he successfully gets the location of the trial switched over to Colorado Springs. Carol Ann Boone had smuggled in plans for the jail in Colorado Springs, which he was able to put to use for a successful escape, at least temporarily. But it ends up being just one of the many ways that Bundy digs his own grave. Now, this is a 8th house perfection year for him, and we get the 8th house in Pisces being activated, and the 6th house being activated as well, because it's in Capricorn and Saturn is 8 signs away. If you perfect from the sect light, which is an approach we haven't even used yet, you do get a 12th house activation, which is a house ruled by the sect light, making that activation all the more the real deal. And we see Ted Bundy engaging in a textbook 12th house activity, the notorious self-undoing. swish. And feel free to jump out of your seats and give a little cheer, unless, of course, you're driving, because that wouldn't be safe. Now, at this point in particular, it becomes a pretty appropriate to question how objectively positive this is from the perspective of Ted Bundy. Certainly in the short term, I'm sure he really enjoyed, it was about 50 days of freedom that, at least in the short term, again, seems very, very fortunate. He was able to tunnel his way out through the ceiling and more or less hitchhike his way to Michigan, and from there take a train down to Florida, where he was quite successful in sustaining himself by stealing credit cards and more or less whatever he needed. He did also have the opportunity to engage in what we all know as Bundy's favorite activity. The crimes that he committed during this time, I would argue, would rank as easily among the most despicable and just reprehensible, brutal attacks on women amongst a laundry list of just horrific crimes against women. On January 15th, the infamous Chi Omega sorority house murders take place, where within 15 minutes, Bundy assaults 4 women, murdering 2 of them, grievously and permanently injuring the other 2 before slipping away into the night. And then 3 weeks later, on February 8th, he attempted to convince a 14-year-old girl who happened to be the daughter of a detective to get in his stolen van with him. She was fortunately saved by the appearance of her brother, which scared Bundy away. But later that afternoon, Bundy made his way to a junior high school about 60 miles away, where a 14-year-old girl, Leslie Palmer, is presumably abducted by Bundy, and her body is found several weeks later. Fortunately, at this point, the police are closing in on Ted. He attempts to make a run for it and is caught near the Alabama state line. Now, on the day of his escape, December 28th, 1977, Saturn is at about 15 minutes, 0 degrees and 15 minutes retrograde in Virgo. It's almost like Ted was able to slip away while Saturn was looking the other way. And while I'll give Saturn in Bundy's first house, the lion's share of credit for providing the ingredients in the creation of, the monster that Ted Bundy was, Saturn's not really Bundy's friend either, Saturn still plays the role of the bearer of ill fortune in Bundy's life as well as everyone else's. And, this is not letting Bundy off the hook by any stretch, but I'm sure if given the choice, Bundy, wouldn't have chosen this life for himself, or rather, chosen the experiences which led to the formulation of such a wicked and villainous concoction of human impulses and character. I won't dive too deep down the philosophical rabbit hole that leads to, but I don't think any of this was ultimately good for him, But again, if we get on that, if I get on that carousel, I'm never going to get off. But, in regards to Bundy's transits, we have, like I mentioned before, Saturn being activated by the 6th house activation. So Saturn is still generally delivering on its Saturn return agenda for Bundy, but also its 6th house agenda, if you will. And it's temporarily out of action, in a sense, not currently in the 1st house, as of January 28th, the day of Bundy's escape. And Jupiter is also activated by it being an 8th house perfection year. It's Pisces, the sign is activated, and Jupiter has the job of delivering on the 8th house agenda for Bundy's life, again, if you will. And when you consider that Jupiter is in its exaltation at the moment of Bundy's escape, on the cusp of retrograding out of the sign of Cancer, out of Bundy's 12th house. As I understand a planet like Jupiter, its inclination is to deliver, positive things according to its ability, given whatever condition it happens to be in, which, sometimes results in misguided attempts that are not good, either for the native of the chart or other people. But in this specific context, I can't help but wonder who Jupiter is being a benefic for. in this specific context is, Jupiter exalted in his 12th house, doing the world a favor, being a benefic for the world, and keeping Bundy in prison. And then as he slips back into Gemini, he's sort of briefly unable to do his, theoretical job there. And then there is Mars, which is, maybe not being specifically activated by perfection, but given that the moon is, and Mars being conjunct his moon natally, and then conjunct Mars transiting, in the sky over his ascendant. It had, Mars had just stationed retrograde a couple weeks before, right around his ascendant. Meanwhile, Neptune is conjunct his natal moon, which, as you may recall, Neptune was conjunct his natal Mars during his last escape. And, the moon and Mars being eclipsed in the 5th house natally for him in Sagittarius, I can, really see how there's kind of a story there, or at least given how his life had unfolded up to this point of these eclipsed planets kind of delivering on a sort of slipping away in secret in a way that is hidden in an effort to, gain freedom. Uranus is also, transiting his IC, making its way over to Venus, but also opposing his MC. And we have a moment where he's, literally making a break for freedom by means of a secret plan that will become part of his reputation and serve as, one of several sort of claims to fame he has. I mean, he's been dead for over 30 years, and here we are talking about him right now. And then if we fast forward a little bit to January 15th, the day of the Chi Omega sorority house murders, Saturn is back in his 1st house. Jupiter is fully backed out into his 11th house, substantially diminished from its exaltation to its detriment. So, just to speak on it in very broad terms, whatever its agenda is at this time in regards to Bundy, it's very much diminished in its capacity to do that job. I'm just noticing right now that the North Node is transiting Neptune. Well, really over the last several years transiting his South Node, but is, pretty much exactly on his moon. And you know what? I don't know what that means. And, I'd be very interested to hear if anybody has any ideas on that. But, it's probably irrelevant. There's already so much going on that very accurately describes the events that are unfolding. But Mars, it's retrograding, and you can see it's making good speed backwards. And often when you initiate an activity that is closely correlated with a planet that is stationing retrograde or in a place in the sky where it's going to move backwards and have to come back to, that generally indicates that whatever you initiated is going to be, reversed in some way, or at the very least, you're going to have to go back and do it over again. So as Mars makes its way back towards Cancer, towards Bundy's 12th house, a sign where Mars also happens to be in its fall, while this is happening, Bundy is doing shit that is going to put him exactly in the same conditions that Mars is going to be in. That is in the 12th house in prison and fallen completely down and out of luck. And then by February 8th, the day Bundy takes a shot and fails to abduct a local detective, as well as the day that Kimberly Lech goes missing, Mars is solidly in Cancer at 25 degrees, still retrograde. Neptune has very recently separated from the conjunction with the moon. So, maybe the sort of vanishing spell that Neptune performed is wearing off. He's kind of rematerializing as the police close in on him. And then February 15th, he is recaptured after a scuffle with 2 police officers who he managed to get away from momentarily after kicking one of their guns away in the scuffle, but then quickly gave up after one of them fired a warning shot at him. And a couple interesting things happen right at this time, or perhaps more interestingly, don't happen. See, given that this is an 8th house year for Bundy, and, Bundy has a night chart, and Venus is the more powerful benefic planet, generally speaking. So you might think that Venus, having just entered Pisces, and his 8th house might maybe help him, avoid punishment just like a little bit. Perhaps this is just a little bit of speculation on my part, but if we look at what Venus is doing, we see that Venus has just left Aquarius, a Saturn-ruled sign. Saturn has not been very nice to Venus in Bundy's chart, and just at this moment, or within the last day, Venus has just separated from an opposition with Saturn in Leo and sort of escaped over the border into Pisces, where Venus is exalted. Venus is powerful and completely unconfigured to Saturn. And in Bundy's 8th house, this is also a Jupiter-ruled sign, given, maybe some other speculations I've made about what Jupiter's job this year is. I might think that a exalted Venus in that condition, under those circumstances and in that moment, might use her power to deliver just a little bit of 8th house justice to the native in question of this particular birth chart. A bit of divine justice that will make the world a bit of a safer place for Venuses everywhere. It also bears noting that Jupiter, though still in Gemini, stations direct just 3 days after that. And really, for all intents and purposes, the sort of week preceding a station direct tends to be a auspicious time for a planet. Astrologically speaking, it's gaining power. It's a boxer who's, gone like 10 rounds, and the coach is massaging his shoulders, giving him a pep talk, and he is finding his second wind and ready to, get back in the ring and start busting some jaws, throwing some elbows. Now, if we zoom out again and maybe revisit the question that I began this segment with of whether, this was an overall positive time for Bundy, speaking in terms of the overall outcome, like, was this the astrological equivalent of baby's day out for Bundy? We may never know the actual answer to that. I suppose it becomes a question of how likely it was for Bundy to maybe have been found not guilty back in Colorado. The court that he had transferred to in Colorado Springs was notably more hostile towards murder suspects, but, the evidence was still not that great. It wasn't, it was kind of flimsy. But now he is in Florida, and Florida has an electric chair that just loves having the butts of prisoners on it. Florida is, ranked in the top 5 in terms of, total number of executed death row inmates on record. So while we'll never know if Bundy would have been executed if he had stayed put in Colorado, it's fair to say that he didn't do anything to help his chances by relocating himself to the Florida justice system. Now, I could certainly keep going. Bundy did live another 10 or 11 years after this, but I will take this moment to wrap it up. And, I want to say thank you to anybody that made it all the way to the end. If, you enjoyed this and you would like to see more, leave a review or subscribe and comment and all that as it relates to the platform with which you are consuming this media. And if you would like a reading with me, while I am not at the time of this recording available for live consultations just yet, though I plan to be very soon, you can purchase a recorded reading from me on my Etsy store, which I will include a link for. Otherwise, you can, go to Etsy.com and search Fluorescent Black. That would be the shop name. Or you can check out my website. There is a link there at KylePierceAstrology.com. I believe that will cover it. Thank you, everybody, for joining me, and I will see you next time.